celebrate what they can do. Don't start from where would you like your child to go. One of the techniques actually that we use in SLTs is role reversal. So you can do that with language. So, now I am the child and you're the teacher. Can you teach me that, for example?
Yes.
Welcome back to another episode of the Unspoken Words Podcast, a Selective Mutism podcast by the Smart Center, produced and published by New Edition Productions. This episode features a discussion between Dr. E and speech and language therapist Anna Biavati. Anna Biavati is a multilingual speech and language therapist based over in Scotland, specializing in selective mutism, communication anxiety, and confidence building in children. With 20 plus years of experience, she has created the Brave Muscle Method and Brain Function approach, helping families unlock their child's voice through emotional safety and nervous system regulation. Her holistic work combines movement, clean eating, and brain-based strategies. Anna runs the Awesome Power Academy for Kids, where confidence precedes speech, and shares tools through her YouTube channel, workshops, and online community. Passionate about empowering parents as partners, her approach is grounded in science, empathy, and her experience as a bilingual mother, offering support in English, Italian, and Spanish. In this episode of Unspoken Words, Dr. E and Anna discuss bilingualism and multilingualism's connection to selective mutism, the differences between speech and language difficulties and general anxiety, treatment and school-based accommodations for children with speech and language challenges, and more. Before we get started, if you have any questions on anything you hear in today's episode, please head to selectivemutismcenter.org/ask Dr. E and enter your questions. The team reads all your submissions and does their best to answer them on podcast episodes, blog posts, and on social media. Speaking of social media, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and YouTube. On Instagram, we are unspokenwords_podcast, and on YouTube, we are Unspoken Words Podcast by Dr. E. All right, without further ado, please enjoy the latest episode of the Unspoken Words Podcast.
Hi, everyone. It's Dr. E. Before we get started with today's episode, I'm so excited to announce that our popular Selective Mutism in the School virtual conference is now available as a self-paced online course. The conference dives into how to assess the mute child, testing for common comorbidities, and proven strategies and interventions to support students with SM within the school. And of course, we dive into accommodations and interventions such as 504s and IEPs. The course offers 5.5 continuing education credits for most professionals, so parents, share this opportunity with your child's school. To sign up, just head to our website or check the description in this podcast episode. Together, we can create a world where every child has a voice. Now, enjoy the episode. Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Unspoken Words. I am excited, as I always say, and today I have the honor and privilege to be with Anna Biavati, a speech and language pathologist who specializes in selective mutism. And you're all the way in Scotland, Anna.
I am. Thank you so much for having me. That's an honor.
Well, we're really excited. You know, often we have guests that bring different topics to the table, but they may not always work 100% with SM or majority of their practice with SM. So it ends up being very interesting because they'll learn more about SM. I'll learn more about different aspects of what they do in their career. And it ends up being just wonderful from a podcast standpoint. Our listeners love it. One of the things I love about you is that you really are like me. You focus most of your practice on helping and treating children with selective mutism.
That's correct. It's been a journey. I've not always done that, but I've made a conscious choice because of my experience. And unfortunately, I'm only one of 3 therapists in the whole of Scotland that treat children with selective mutism. So I kind of thought, you know what? I love being a speech therapist. I've treated children with so many difficulties, but SM is mainly and only what I do.
So what made you so passionate about it?
So it's a long story. So when I went to university many years ago, 25 years ago, nobody ever talked about selective mutism. And I would say 8 years in my job, so it's a long time, I met my first child that came to the clinic and stood in the middle of my therapy clinic. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was. And can we talk about love at first sight? I kind of went, oh, this is just what is happening. And mom had come so prepared and had videos and kept saying, nobody believed me that my child can speak. And actually saw it happen, and that child was exposed to 3 languages. It was really, really chatty. And she kept saying, see, he speaks, but he's not speaking here. So I made my whole, really the last 17 years of my career, understanding, studying, exploring, deepening, and then without actually my knowledge, so I know exactly how he feels, my child also had selective mutism, but I didn't know. Somebody actually told me in a joking way, oh, do you know that actually your child doesn't speak to anybody at nursery? And I was like, no, nobody's ever told me. So my child spoke to me, and that was 3 years. And I'd never realized. So I know exactly how he feels. So here it is.
Yeah. And so we have that in common, right? Like the journey of, well, falling in love with this. I'm also a mother of a child and was very misunderstood. She was so misunderstood. So people that know my journey. So we have that in common. And the fact that this is such a passionate, like, love interest of ours, because we know that, one, we can help kids and that they're very misunderstood. So from a speech and language pathologist standpoint, how do you go about this? Like, from an SM standpoint. And then I want to get into the whole bilingualism aspect and multilingual aspect of this. But like when you're thinking about it, you talk about the brave muscle, aspect. So tell us a little bit about that.
So although I am an SLP, so a speech and language pathologist, my approach is grounded in brain development. And it's just something that I've always loved. So I see that communication is more than using words. And that's why I always say selective mutism is more than the fear of speaking. But this is what people see out there. Because as human beings, this is what we do best, right? I see that communication from a child's point of view is a whole body, is a whole way that the child is positioned. And they're able to show us how they feel. Do they feel safe? Do they feel connected? Do they feel co-regulated? And as a speech and language therapist, the first thing that we know that develops is good eye contact and reciprocity and playing. That is the beginning of communication. So I integrate my approach from the neuroscience, from rhythmic movement. I love Daniel Siegel. I love so many of the people that I studied with. And, often people say, oh, you're a little bit unusual. You don't focus mainly on speech, because I totally believe that children need to feel regulated in order to play with us, in order to laugh with us, in order to emit sounds, and then so on and so forth. So language, after all, is definitely more than words. And if a child can connect with us, or a teenager, or even an adult, then they feel safe, they feel seen, and then the larynx will relax, and then more sounds will come on. So that's really mainly what I focus on.
I think you articulated it really well. And it's interesting because when you work with this population, you may come at it from different perspectives, and for me, coming at it from a physician standpoint and understanding why you have a symptom, and then, why is that there? That is what dictated my whole process of understanding SM as a social communication anxiety. And basically, you're using a lot of like similar thoughts as I do, like basically comfort, connection precedes communication. That's in line. And that they have to feel safe and regulated. That's in line. And then it's a whole person approach, basically. So I don't treat to speak either. I treat to I understand to be able to treat. And in order to really be successful with this population, as you're sharing, you've got to understand that person. It's not just treat to speak, because how many families do you see, probably like me, that come to us going, I was seeing a therapist and the focus was on talking and my child was shutting down and now she's more avoidant and I'm really frustrated and I really want her to speak. And I'm like, stop, let's stop. And so much of our work, it sounds like, is similar in the sense that we're really trying to understand that child or teen and adults, helping them feel safe, helping them understand. And what you said, I loved, which is the look, listen, and learn. And that's what you're doing too. You're looking, you're listening, and you're learning. And so much of what they're saying is nonverbal.
Absolutely. But as a speech and language therapist, The same approach applies, and that's what I used to teach at university, even if you're treating a speech and sound disorder. Then, although children are not necessarily scared of talking, they don't really know what to do with their mouth. But equally, they still need to feel safe and secure to try to articulate and move the tongue in a certain position. Now, kids with SN not only have that, because they don't really know, because the fear kind of stops them. So that's kind of more the motor aspect of it. But because I'm a speech and language therapist, it comes with a baggage that they focus and they go, right, so that's what you do. You can fix my child's speech, right? And I feel that you and I have that bridge, that we really want the world to understand that communication can be done through looking. And one of the first things that I always teach parents is think about even exchanging. So paying or laughing whilst in the supermarket, that's communication. But it takes me a while for them to trust me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? Social engagement is the precursor to communication. And that's what I was going to say. The whole handover, the takeover, the front line, and giving them the opportunities and respecting their sensory sensitivities that many of them have, not going to Target at 2:00, but maybe practicing at an off time. There's a lot of overlap there. And one of the things that, as you know, because you listen to me a lot, is that I always want to understand why. What are the factors into the development and maintenance? And I feel like I say that so much, but it's so true. And, the topic I thought we could talk about, and as I shared, we can always do more topics, right? Because of the depth of your knowledge and interest, we certainly can always do more, is the bilingualism and multilingualism aspect to SM. Because not all kids are bilingual or multilingual, but that's a specific subset of the population that we cannot ignore. There's a
Absolutely.
cultural aspect to it as well, but the actual language. So, would you share with us your experience in working with bilingual and multilingual children with selective mutism?
Absolutely. I am a multilingual therapist myself. I brought my children to be bilingual, Italian English. And as I said to you, my daughter, who's now 17, has a bilingual experience. And she understood in her case and spoke Italian really well, because that's the language that my parents spoke to me. But every time, because we've always lived in Scotland, every time we went to Italy, she would fall into silence. Not because she didn't know that. And she had the world around her that constantly told her, oh, doesn't your mom speak Italian to you? So that was the assumption. And she used to get really upset about that, because Italian was very much a part of our life. But she didn't feel confident using Italian with people that she didn't know. And obviously, she was very anxious. And that experience really has profoundly shaped the way I work and support bilingual children and their family. And I really want to, both for the children and the family, to build resilience across the languages, because bilingualism or multilingualism doesn't necessarily mean that you're speaking a lot of languages. Is about how, where do you feel that you can speak that language? And it's very much a family dynamic, because every bilingual or multilingual family will be different, as we will explore today.
Oh, for sure. There's so many different types. There's families that speak multiple languages and then combine the languages, right? And then there's families that speak one language and their cultural aspect, even their nonverbal or their body language. And then the child goes, let's say, into an English speaking preschool and is only speaking Spanish at home and feels uncomfortable, we can talk about. But then there's the family, let's say the English family, that moves to, let's say, Yugoslavia, another country. And now they're in a whole nother country going in with only English and then putting into a school that's speaking a different language. So there's all different types.
Absolutely.
And some of these children may have otherwise. So the bilingualism, may have been an impetus, but sometimes a lot of them have otherwise, the timidity, the sensory issues, maybe they have other challenges going on too that we have to kind of decipher. But, one of the things that stands out is, how do you determine when these symptoms are anxiety based or it's due to their like inability to understand the language? How would you tell our listeners to differentiate that?
So here is very much about quantity and the way that the child uses language. Because as a speech therapist, in order to determine a speech and language delay or a speech and language disorder is very much about how much language does a child have. And that's why we start kind of looking and analyzing how is the language used within the home. So that's why, I always begin with, conversations with parents without the child present, because I want to understand how exactly, as you were saying, how do they use the language at home? Is it the OPAL, one parent, one language? Is it situational bilingualism? Or I would like, which I have a lot of them, in Italy, they really love their children to learn English. So they teach them English whilst they play, but they're not necessarily English speaking. And, first language, English is not their first language. So when a child has a language delay, they would always try, but the language doesn't come as fluidly as we would expect. There are some parts that they are missing, or they're not quite saying quite well. They're quite willing to imitate, and imitation is one of the most important skills for language development. But and don't get me wrong, you can have both. I don't come across a lot of them, but when there is the anxiety, there is you can see them that they can't imitate. They find that process really hard. They freeze. They are quite rigid. You can see them on their breathing, the way they play, they don't look at you, all the things that we've talked about physically before. And they engage in a very quiet and different way, because a child that doesn't have language doesn't necessarily mean that they find communication difficulty and hard. So they would point and they would do all sorts of things. But a child with SM would also find pointing or sharing quite difficult. And the curiosity is also dampened by that sense of insecurity and the freeze response that they have.
So knowing, we've done a lot of, work with speech and language, under Dr. Evelyn Klein and Dr. Sharon Armstrong, and there's been many, research-based articles. And one of the things that I was so passionate about when I first met Dr. Klein was to be able to assess children with SM, because now we find over 30% of children with SM have an underlying speech and language. So putting bilingualism aside and being a speech pathologist, like for us, we have this evidence-based way of assessing children with SM, because one of the biggest problems is a child selectively mute, whatever their why may be. How do you assess a mute child's speech and language? Sure, videos from home and hearing them speak, but an actual kind of, concrete, true way of assessing their language. And I'm sure you're familiar with the ability to use parents as evaluators. So,
Really, so important.
right? So for us, under the guidance of a speech and language pathologist, they will assess the child's true skills using standardized measures. And it's a very valid way of testing kids. And a family may go, well, wait, why? Because the child is the most relaxed with their parent. And so when they see a stranger, someone they don't know, it takes them a while to warm up. They may never speak to the level, because children that are anxious may speak quiet, even if they can speak, right? Quiet, one or two words. They may not be initiative and elaborative. And do they have a speech and language difficulty, or are they anxious? And so using these test methods, and we do so much speech and language testing. I mean, people travel from everywhere and anywhere for us to do these evaluations. They then share it with the school. And it's so important to be able to see. And so what are the screening questions that you give families, like at home, like for a child that does have a speech and language issue underlying? We'll get it, with the bilingualism, of course, and we'll get into that. But I think it's really important, since you're a speech and language pathologist, to kind of touch on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that one of the things that just want to add on what you're saying is that when you're anxious, you don't perform the way really you're able to. Even, for example, a lot of people say, oh, yeah, but they don't need to talk if we assess their comprehension. But when they're really anxious, the amygdala just fogs their brain. And even the answers that they might not necessarily be, oral answers can be fogged by the anxiety. So one of the things, so we are the same. I have to say, maybe in the UK, we don't necessarily have a standardized, we work on standardized assessments, but most of them actually are still very much, run by speech therapists. And the problem is that they will never speak the same way. So I have a whole list of, scenarios and situations and questions that allow me to assess the MLU, which is the mean letter of utterance. So how many words do they use, their grammatical structure, how do they respond, how do they respond socially, do they understand, do they have to be given specific cues, do they have to respond, do they have to repeat the questions again, because again, memory plays a big role. So also, if a child is slightly older, reading, decoding, writing, all this sort of thing that we gather, and exactly as you said, we gather always in the same way. So the more responses we have, the more evidence we have, because obviously as a speech and language therapist, I also do analysis. But why do they have that problem? Why do we discover, and you've written a few papers on it, actually more than a few papers, is because of the uses of the language. And this is where the neurodevelopment is really important. And we do this a lot with people that have had a stroke. So when you don't have the opportunity to use language as often, you lose or you don't gain the same experience as children that they can speak. That is really why it's so important for people like you and I to make the world aware that SM is not something that we've made up, but we really want people to see it as soon as they can, because the earlier it's treated, the child will be more resilient. And we're not talking about a child that has been in school for many, many years without the opportunity to use language appropriately in an educational setting.
Right. No, exactly. And so one of the things that at least I would tell a family is when your child is at home and talking to you, are they initiative? Are they elaborative? Do they say, I don't know a lot? A lot of kids with speech and language issues will go, I don't know. They get frustrated trying to explain themselves. And you find out that a percentage of these kids do. And why I think it's confusing for some parents, and why, in my opinion, testing is valuable, is that parents can read their children's nonverbals like no other. Your child can stand there and tilt their head a certain way, and you're like, oh, you're hungry. Or, they just stand a different way, and, oh, you got to go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom. Like we read them. So their language for us, it's like, it's different. And when they get into the school environment where the language, as Dr. Klein said, is deconceptualized language, it's so much harder for these kids. So now we've got kids that may have a speech and language issue, but they may not. And then there's the bilingualism. So understanding the whys, but let's get back into the bilingualism. But I thank you about that, because I think it's important for our listeners to understand from a speech and language pathologist how important it is to understand whether your child does or doesn't have an underlying speech and language issue, expressive, receptive, with the majority having more expressive challenges for sure. And then also not just developmentally, but acquired, right, Anna? So like if you go years not having give, take, back, forth of social communication, you develop an acquired speech and language issue where you may not be initiative, elaborative, and expressive, even though underneath you had the ability. You just didn't have the opportunity.
Yes, is the development of that muscle. That's exactly what it is. The brain adapts and the brain doesn't develop that. Absolutely.
I love that with the brain muscle, because that's like hand over takeover. I tell people all the time that simple act is like going to the gym and working your biceps. It's your social communication, muscles. There's a lot of similarities coming at it from different perspectives. So can you help us talk about accounting for cultural and linguistic norms that may influence communication expectation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that culture plays a huge role. So, I obviously was brought up until I was late teen in a different country. So, in some families and in some culture, it is seen as respectful for children to be very quiet in front of adults. In other cultures, making mistakes is highly discouraged or criticized or commented on. And if you have an anxious child, and if you come, no offense, the Italian community, that they always got something to say, and your child feels the spotlight, it doesn't really matter. They don't mean it badly, but it's just the culture. But if you don't know the culture, then you don't know how to handle it. So I always ask, what are the parents' thoughts about communication, especially when they were growing up? What do their grandparents expect? What is the society around them? Where do they live? Because like yourself, I support people all over the world. We have Italian and Spanish people that live all over the world. So it depends, where did they grow up? Where was the child born? How are they bringing their child up? So for example, if let's say a child has been corrected all the time by the grandparents, oh, you don't say it like that, or oh, you speak Italian, but you sound English. So they're commenting on something that for them is quite precious, and they were finding it hard anyway. They've made a comment, they can't take it, they don't have that resilience, and they don't try that language anymore. So sometimes parents say to me, oh, they understand my language, but they never speak it. But for me, it's about being competent, not only in understanding the language, but also being able to say it. And I often say to parents, think about yourself when you go on holiday. I always try, okay, I speak a bit of German, I speak French and Spanish and Italian, whatever. But if I go to a country, I don't know, like last year I went to Morocco, I really tried to say things in Arabic because I think it's nice, right? And I have to say, I was so accepted, and people were kind of like almost cheering me on. But obviously, I don't have SM, but it made me feel accepted that I was trying a little bit more. So, but when a child then is quite vulnerable and gets criticized, or they speak with an accent and they didn't want to know that, then that has a huge impact, and they feel shamed, they withdraw even more. And I do find that my population of bilingual and multilingual children are very sensitive. And this could be a turning point in their willingness to even continue to try to speak or to use the language that maybe is used at home. So it's very, very important for me to adapt my approach to model vulnerability around their family and their culture. So if it's for them, it's okay that I make a mistake, then I would do that. But it's not, I would adapt.
So talk to us about the silent period. So these children speak a specific language at home. They go into a school environment, and now there's a different language in the school, because that's usually where this seems to be the most challenging. And perhaps cultural ways too, like they're different, even nonverbal, how they gesture. But talk to us about the silent period, because that's such an instrumental term, but it's also so real. It's what they're going through. So many of these kids, how can they have conversation when they can't even necessarily translate? So talk to us about that.
So the silent period is specifically for, well, we talk about it for children that have got English, for example, as a second language. So if, for example, they've moved from South America to the UK, they've not really been exposed to English very much. So there is a time of adaptation. And researchers have defined it as silent as the child is gathering all the language, kind of trying to understand what's happening around them. And for me, that I observe them physically. Before I became an expert in SM, I used to obviously do a lot of bilingual assessment. I used to see those children still playing, running around, wanting to communicate. Language wasn't a barrier. They would still use nonverbal communication, like they would pull the carer or the teacher and show them, or do some signing, although they were like 3 or 4 years old. So the silent period is linked to, I don't have that word for apple. I only call it mela. For me, that's what an apple is. So they need to be exposed. So exposure is very, very important. So they can see, and then they hear, and then they create that neuronal pathway. And then eventually the brain talks to the muscle, and then the word comes. But when that silent period is longer than 6 months and is not just based on speech, so these children find it really difficult to imitate. So you say apple and they repeat apple, or they don't sing when you're singing. They don't copy any, I don't know, Incy Wincy Spider songs or whatever. So they are frozen. So we see that naturally they are not moving around the kindergarten or preschool or at school time is definitely way more. And this is what I teach teachers. You've got to look beyond the ability to make sounds. They don't even sneeze, they don't even cough, they don't even cry. So the silent period is focused on language, but actually for our SM children, we need to look at the way they express themselves.
Hey listeners, we'll get back to the episode in a second. I want to tell you about CommuniCamp, our popular 3+ day intensive group treatment and all-day parent education and support program designed to help parents, children, and teens overcome selective mutism, social anxiety, and extreme shyness. Over 3+ action-packed days, your child or teen will engage in immersive activities guided by expert clinicians that build confidence and communication skills in a supportive, fun, and collaborative environment. Spaces are limited and spots book up fast. To learn more, please find CommuniCamp in this episode's description or head to communicamp.org and complete our interest form, and our team will be in touch. Let's help your child or teen find their voice at CommuniCamp. Let's get back to the episode. I guess with this population having such a strong social anxiety component and fear of judgment, perfectionism, we see in this population a lot, and making a mistake and sometimes high expectation parents on top of it, like you need to talk, you need to say hi to your teacher. Like there's all these different aspects. So they're speaking, let's say, Spanish at home, and then they go into an English speaking preschool, at least from America. That's the more typical, like going into from a different language into an English language. And they've got the social anxiety, the high sensitivity, some of these kids. And now they're like in this school and they're still, like you said, they're thinking of things in their own language. So I see it exaggerated because of that high expectation for speech too. So this goes back to that treat to speak method of you need to speak and you should speak. And they're so focused on speaking that the kids become very avoidant as well. And I imagine that only exacerbates that natural silent period because now their social anxiety, their sensitivity, but also the push to speak can only exaggerate it. So what may have been an impetus early on, that behavior of avoidance and a higher anxiety around speaking is sticking around, Anna. So even though if they had just almost like, I hate to say it, but let them be a little bit and respect where they were at and meeting them where they were, that those children may not have developed a full-blown SM, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I think that especially when they go to kindergartens, the role of the teachers there and the support workers is to show them or to meet them halfway. So know few words in the language that the child speaks because it's to do with familiarity. And when we are familiar with something, and that is across the board, that's something that we see, something that we smell, something that we feel, something that, we have inside us, then, all those neuronal synapses, oh, they're calming. As I'm talking to you, for example, something that really calmed me was the smell of my granny's cake. So every time I used to go to her house and I smell that cake, I felt quite calm. Children are the same. So if from a language standpoint of view, if the teacher was to say, oh, gracias or danke, whatever language the child speaks, the child on the other side, without expectation that the child has to say it back, is I am accepting, I am embracing. That's very much we take the child as an individual. And it will also make the child feel, oh, you know a word that I also know, especially again for those children that, are learning English in our case as a second language. So language is not seen as anxiety provoking, but unfortunately it is.
Yeah, no, for sure. So let's get into, like, I call it the meat and potatoes, the treatment, school-based accommodations. So how do you integrate both languages into treatment? And do you do that? And if so, how? And then we can kind of talk about that.
So was very much in the early part of my work. I don't really do a lot of treatment nowadays. So I do a little bit, I do more teaching, just because so many people don't know enough about SM. But if I can integrate both languages into treatment, I would, because as a multilingual speech and language therapist, if I had a Spanish, an Italian, or a French speaker, we always evaluate what is their L1, which is their language that they feel most comfortable with. So if I don't know that language very well, they're obviously still multilingual, I will use it in play. I will make myself a couple of, is a list of words. I will always make a space for it. And in the same time, I will have the parents involved to teach me a word or teach me a sign, because I want to show them that I've got an interest in their culture. That obviously based on what we've talked about earlier. Are both parents from the same country, or is it one parent, one language? Whatever that is really to create that power of shift that the child feels proud. Oh, I know, or you're trying, or maybe in my case, I want them to laugh at me. Because I'm being funny, and that's something is one of my superpowers. So many bilingual children fear of being heard speaking their own home language, so their L1, because the one that they told me is they will laugh at because I'm speaking differently. They're also, when this happens at school, they are also worried about being laughed at or sounding different when they speak English. And that happens in my own experience when they are from parents that they are from the same country. So, for example, both parents are from Poland, grandparents are from Poland. They spend a lot of time speaking Polish. So actually, from an output point of view, from a phonological point of view, their ability to articulate English with the accent of the place where they are growing up is slimmer because they don't practice. So they might sound different. They know that they sound different, or sometimes they maybe have not developed all the sounds, right? So part of my job is for them to shift and to build that superpower muscle, really to make them see that their multilingualism is a superpower, and rather than it's something that people will laugh at.
I love how you talked about the superpower. It's like a big shot role. I call it the big shot role, you know? And some ways that we integrate it into treatment is if you have a family, and I'm just going to use Spanish because, I mean, we could say Italian, it doesn't really matter, but that's what they're speaking at home. But yet the child goes to an English speaking preschool or English speaking school, that to have designated times where the entire family, not just that child, is speaking English. So we will set timers, and it might start with simple words like colors. It might, it might be reading, because reading is easier than just talking if they're able to read. And so we start with these designated timers, and not to isolate the child out a lot, but yet as a family, we're learning, because some children are very sensitive to this. So we will do that. Also, that superpower, right? Or that big shot role of teaching a friend. So the concept of comfort, connection precedes communication, all of those basic SCAT in my world, the CBT-based program, obviously I'm passionate about, is about helping these children cross the social communication bridge and understand themselves. And so to me, that all those concepts of the buddy process, the small groups, not, understanding progress doesn't happen in the middle of an assembly. So at home with a get together, or in a small room, or in a spot in the classroom, building those connections with a few kids at a time, and giving that child the opportunity to maybe teach colors or shapes or simple words to other children in their own native language. I've had children that have been completely mute, and then they come and then all of a sudden you see them, but yet you give them the opportunity to teach you something, the big shot role, right? They start to talk just from that. If they have they have appropriate language skills, that's not an issue. They're talking. And even kids with speech and language challenges one or two words is usually, that's not usually that difficult. It's the expressive language that's more difficult. But teaching others that language has been amazing. We do this at Communicamp all the time, where kids come and that they may speak different languages and they're like proud of their language and their culture, right? So we utilize that superpower, that big shot role. And it's amazing how that is a bridge for them to communication. And then once they have that opened up, they will then transition into more English words. So we use that kind of bridge. How do you feel about that? Do you like that?
I absolutely love it, because you are starting from a place of safety, from something
Yep.
that they can do really well. You meet their children where they're at. And one of the techniques actually that we use in SLTs is role reversal. So you can do that with language. So, now I am the child and you're the teacher. Can you teach me that sound, for example?
Yes.
So if we do that in terms of the language, it's amazing. So something really funny that I want to share, I'm sure you know that already, actually, the Italians speak with their body, right? But we definitely have our own sign language, or we add gestures, which are really, really funny for people that they're not grown up in Italy, that they mean a lot, and children absolutely love it. When somebody says, what do you want? And they use their hands like that. And people just say, what is that you're doing with your hand? That is quite funny. But if a child was brought up with parents that do that all the time, they find that bread and butter. That's what everybody else does, right? So I think that you're right. There is the expectation, but you spoke yesterday in the shop, so why can you not do that in assembly? And that blows my mind. That's a different situation. There are different expectations. It's a different language. So we need to teach both teachers and parents to help their children to celebrate small steps and make them realize they can also teach others what they know. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Yeah, no. So that's worked, really well. And the timers worked. And sometimes I'll have the kids send us updates like, we spoke for 60 minutes in English today or something. And they try to beat the timer the next day, because some of it's just for some of these children, they just don't have the confidence in that language that is spoken in the school or so spoken from a social. So they go into school and they see the kids, everybody's talking in their language, but the child that's bilingual or multi is trying to digest that language, trying to interpret it and join in. And they may already be anxious to begin with from a social anxiety standpoint. So it's just kind of snowballs. So we have to pull it back, isolate it out, and so forth.
Dr. E, I think it's to do with exposure. So language develops through exposure, accent develops through exposure. And what I love is about the family dynamic approach. We're all in it. It's not just about the child. We really need to stop, taking the focus out of the child. Oh, well, but it's my child that is not speaking. Yes, but children learn through exposure. Children learn through modeling. So if you are from a bilingual background, I do exactly the same. Can you go to the shop and say, right, when we're in the shops and when we're going to the supermarket or when we're going for that walk, we will be speaking English because I also need to practice. You are my teacher. Or it is really about, I need to use that language. I actually want to share something really personal. I didn't do that to begin with, but we're talking about many years ago. And my oldest son one day said to me, oh, Mom, I feel really sad for you. And I said, oh, why is that? And he said, oh, because, you must go to work and you don't understand what they're saying and you don't speak English. And I went, oh, my God. He had never heard me speak English. I mean, he doesn't have SN, but that was quite an observant thing. And he thought that I was only speaking Italian, but he obviously realized that nobody else around me did speak Italian, which they didn't, obviously. And I thought, how observant. That really made me change, to make them realize that I also spoke of the place where we lived.
Yeah, the kids are like, they say it the way it is.
Yeah, but then if you're multilingual, bilingual, and also you don't have the opportunity to use English like in school, because you can't, because, the words are blocked, because that muscle is not quite yet developed and you don't feel that comfortable, then if you don't practice, if you don't use it, you lose it. So that's why, as parents, It's not about let's force it, let's embrace it. So you can make lists, you can, games, there are so many games that we play. And that's exactly as you said, reading, because reading is decoding, is not creating, is there. And you're showing that you're putting yourself, you're doing something that they're also doing it too. Yeah, I definitely think.
Again, for our listeners and respecting the stages on the social communication bridge and understanding that even with these strategies, the child still may be bridging, whether using an intermediary, a really big strategy for me in terms of transition is because a lot of kids become professional mimes. They're very comfortable non-verbally. Is that transitional stage 2. And so sounds and shaping sounds into words for some of our bilingual children, especially if they're not so confident in that other language, using the sounds to words approach is very helpful because it is breaking words down. And that has been a very successful type strategy to work with bilingual children. And with little kids, it's just fun use of sounds, shaping fun use and making silly sounds and putting the sounds together. It doesn't matter what language you're speaking, frankly, everyone's on the same playing field when you're using goofy sounds and putting them together and making fake words. And now you've got the even playing field. So there's lots of creative ways that teachers and parents can integrate these types of treatment strategies during get-togethers. And even like something, parents are facilitators for us, right? They facilitate the next stage of social communication because we can't just rely on children to go in to school and say, okay, this is what you need to do to help me speak in a message, or during a get-together, I need to do 1, 2, and 3. Yes, when a child's an older teen, they can do that, and we work with them to do it. But parents are the main facilitators. That's why educating parents is so critical, just how they use their language around the child. Tell your friend what where we're going on vacation, this open-ended, thought-provoking situation that they are not prepared for. So all of those concepts of, right to read and, the write and read approach, the script approach, asking more choice questions, direct questions, giving them time to respond, re-asking the question, maybe leaning in, this or that, tell me. I mean, all of these strategies still work and they are utilized with bilingual, multilingual children. So I want our listeners to understand that social communication bridge is just such a critical component. So let me ask you off the record, do you use the bridge at all, or you're familiar with my bridge?
So I'm very familiar and I love the idea of the bridge. I suppose I use Maggie Johnson's approach, which is the stages of confident speaking. So it's basically 8 stages. So it's just broken down in further little steps. So what you call the an intermediary for us would be the bridge. So it would be, I'm happy to have my voice heard, but I'm speaking to my mom. So the idea is the same, that we want to teach both children and parents that there are little tiny little steps that allow us to track where we're at and where we're going. It's like moving. But for me, the steps, the family, and moving and sounds, it all comes all together because everything that you've mentioned has a 3-dimensional aspect to it, because I always add movement to it. So that means making sounds and jumping, making sounds or reading, and we are on a swing. And, I always suggest to get one of those swings that you can hang up from the ceilings. We do very specific brain movements that will allow the brain stems to connect with other aspects of our brain and our body to allow us then the voice to come in a specific way without thinking about the voice. And then that becomes the exposure. So I absolutely want people to understand you've got 1 language, you've got 2 languages, you've got 3 languages. But you've got to adapt everything that you've learned, everything that you hear, in all the languages, because you want them to have that fluidity, to go in and out of both languages with that confidence. And so that's really, really important.
So it's interesting when you say 1 language, 2, 3, I multiply that because what I find happens in some families is they combine the languages. So now they're combining, let's say, Italian and Spanish to have, and they're mixing languages. And then children are mixing languages, and that's what the children are hearing.
Yeah.
So it's multiple languages that are often spoken in some of these households, or they're speaking one language all the time. And so it is working with the whole family. So as far as teachers and school staff to understand the aspect of bilingualism and SM, what would be your kind of go-to statement for a school that has a bilingual, selectively mute child to be able to approach that child? What would you say?
I would say that time is pivotal. And if the child is not speaking or communicating within the first 3 months, I always have a list of what communications I'm expecting them to develop and to use, and not to skip the 3 months. Especially if the child has moved in from a different country, we can maybe stretch it to 6 months, but I don't want them to think the child will grow out of it, because silence, no matter what it is never about defiance. So I really teach them to observe how the child generally is communicating. So also we want to make sure that the child is understanding. So that initial information about the child is pivotal, because the teachers might recognize the difference between learning a language, or like in my case, is my child was already exposed to 2 languages. She could speak already 2 languages. It's not that she didn't speak, English because she didn't want to, because she wasn't exposed enough to English. It was just because a child doesn't speak doesn't mean that they don't understand. And just because that they're not talking, it doesn't mean that they don't want to try. So there is always a happy medium. So for me, one of the first things to say is, let's create visual routines. Would the child let you know where you're at and what you're doing? Create a system of friendship, which is super important. What you would think is the buddy system. And consistent expectations. So give them that control. And I would add movements. Anything that you do, especially here in the UK, children learn for 10, 15 minutes and then they move about. And fourth and not last is to make spaces for all languages, to celebrate the fact that maybe in the classroom, and nowadays it happens all the time, there are children that also speak other languages. So it's not just tolerated, but is accepted and is part of the classroom or the school.
Yeah, no, those are all, just fabulous recommendations. In the States, we have IEPs and 504s.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that. But do they come straight away? Because that's what it is. For us, there's a very specific process.
It's a specific process. And if you're in a private school, they don't have them. You'd have to go into the public school to get either the services. Testing, a lot of families choose private testing and then bring it to the school, which is why testing is such a big part of what we do at the Smart Center, because a lot of times they can't assess these children. They're mute. They don't have the skills and background to know how to assess a mute child. And a lot of times I will see like IEP evaluations where it'll be like, wasn't able to assess speech and language, wasn't able to assess the expressive language. But the parent said this. So this is why testing children, in my opinion, for kids that screen for speech and language or screen for learning processing difficulties, et cetera, are so important. I always look at functioning, right? Social, emotional, academic, and communication functioning. And if functioning is affected and they're not able to engage with peers, they're not able to share their insight, it affects their ability to learn, they should have an evaluation for an IEP. At 504 is a step down, as I call it, in the sense it's still accommodations, interventions, but the learning is not as much affected, so that they don't need more of the specialized education. So it's definitely different in the US, and how you label these children. And a lot of schools will do what we call IEEs, independent educational evals, where private centers will do the evals for them because they know that it's difficult. And I think one of the most important things, and you probably see this in schools a lot, is that with goodwill, with good intent, there's a lot of school professionals and treatment professionals who still see SM as children who just don't speak. And so the focus becomes so much on getting them to speak, and their educational plan is a plan to get them to be brave to talk when they're not ready yet. You know, some children we talk about talking all the time, and ultimately that is the goal. But we have to be very cognizant of where this child is in his or her journey to what we're able to work on. And if we work too quickly on speaking, we're going to shut them down and avoid. But if we aren't doing enough, we're going to enable their lack of social communication. So it's a balancing act. And that's where working with somebody and understanding, where they're at and what you can say and how you can support the child and student is so important. So that misunderstanding of what this is, and I always go back to, I hate the name SM. I think it's lousy. It implies these kids are just about not talking, and that is just so not true. There's so much more to who they are. I know we're almost out of time, but I imagine you use a lot of things like visuals, right, to support them. That's a big thing that we use, right, because it also helps to minimize the need to think and process and reproducible tasks over and over, so they build that confidence. So how do you use visuals from a speech and language pathologist standpoint with what you do?
So very much exactly as you described. So I give a routine so they know exactly where they are, what to expect, and what we're going to be doing or what they're going to be doing in schools. And it takes the pressure from, sharing or, thinking, because thinking is a big process. So I think you're absolutely right, is that focus on the sounds. But even when we assess children for language delay or those specific SLPs that deal with children with ASD, we know that is way more than using the words. I also use games a lot, and depending on the age of the children, what they like. Yeah, is their way of feeling okay about it, being silly, funny faces. For emotion cards, they are my faces. And they laugh at me, allow that to happen. Or sometimes they can't even do that because they find, oh my God, that she will be mad if I laugh at her. So there is that element as well. But it's really about not, translating. I would have, for example, visual routines in many languages if the child obviously can also read. I want the child to feel seen. That's the most important thing. And another thing is not the just me and the child. Now it doesn't really happen. It's about a small group or something that they feel comfortable with. So it's about them exploring, even where they are at, where do we sit? Those things are really, really important because in at the beginning of my career, we used to be right in the middle of the hallway between many classes. I mean, and people say, well, nobody's listening to you. Yeah, but it was reverberating. It was a huge space. So even just a simple decision of where do I use my visuals? Like, am I in a space that the child feels safe or nobody can see the child just now? That's also as important as everything that I have in my bag. So, but definitely creating the connection in play is one of the biggest things.
Oh, yeah, I love it. And then integrating the strategies within that, right? Creating what games to play with strategies. Like a real big one for me, and I use this a lot with bilingual children that can read, is the kind of the reading of the words is easier than putting their thoughts together to say it. So we do a lot of board games with questions and answers because they're able to speak that language so much easier than just coming up with their thoughts. So that the write, the read, the script approach, asking, I always say this, and it's one of my favorite questions to ask. I ask it all the time, and I look forward to seeing people's hands go up and trying to guess. I'll say to them, I'm going to say this to you because the answer to this is, what are the chances that I can get a child who is verbally responsive, even a few words, doesn't even have to be regular volume, to become initiative within 10 seconds? And the answer is 100%. Because if they can respond, and let's say they can read or sight read, they can read a question. So, do you like dogs? If they're able to answer, they're not afraid. They're not afraid to speak in that moment. And so parents are always amazed. They're like, how did you get him to ask that question? Well, we didn't just start with go up, ask random thought-provoking questions. It was a very predictable questions, and it was in the interest that they had. So whether it's animals or Harry Potter or something like that. And it's such an amazing eye opener for teachers too. And so for some of our bilingual children, and just in general, I use this approach. That kind of script approach is so important with question answers. Then they tend to transition easier into more natural language a lot of times as they're learning it.
It's focusing on where they're at and how.
Yes, meeting them where they're at. Not behind, not in front, where they're at. And it's amazing when that happens, the trust you build with these kids, right? They open up more to you. They share more to you. Because if you're too far ahead, they avoid and they shut down. If you're too far behind, they just shadow and they don't learn the skills and it affects their confidence. So it's a meeting them where they're at.
Yes.
This has been great.
Absolutely. Same here.
Any last minute words you want to say to our listeners?
I would say that take all of this as a journey together, you are learning as the adults, you're walking with your children. Don't push, but just stop, observe, and celebrate what they can do. Don't start from where would you like your child to go. Next is what can my child do right now? What does my child love doing right now?
That's why I love the bridge so much too, because what I see with kids that we work with, and this happens all the time when we see them at camp, is that when they realize they're actually on the bridge, it's amazing how they sit up higher and they seem more proud. Their body language becomes more relaxed because it's not so much, oh, if I don't speak, I'm a failure. It's, wow, I am on the bridge. Look where I'm at. And they understand the different settings. So that bridge is such a means of control and actually confidence boosting for kids. And they make their own bridges. I'm just really big with the bridge, Anna.
Absolutely. And I love the analogy. And I think that would be maybe for another time. I think that especially for older children from the age of 8 upward is to allow them, exactly what you said, to see themselves on the bridge. Because sometimes they are scared to see what they can do because they're scared that we're going to push them. But unless we have the parents undo what they've done, which is like, come on, you can do it, and just sit and watch, that would allow them, no matter how old they are, to really recognize this is me. And then you can build on that. That is fundamental. If you can do that, that's a big one.
Well, this has been wonderful, Anna. Would you share with us your YouTube channel and your different socials just so they hear it?
Certainly. You can find me on YouTube. I'm forever posting videos on request as well. And it is Steps to Brave Talking. And you'll find me online as Steps to Brave Talking. And I'm also on Facebook as Selective Mutism Hub. So that's where you will find me.
Oh, this is great. Thank you. This has been such a privilege. I appreciate all this.
And it's a privilege for me. Thank you so much, Dr. E. Speak to you soon.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for listening to Unspoken Words, a Selective Mutism podcast hosted by me, Dr. E, and the Smart Center. This episode and all episodes of Unspoken Words is produced by New Edition Productions. Don't forget to submit any questions you have from today's episode using our Ask Dr. E form on our website. Just head to selectivemutismcenter.org/ask-DRE. I'd love to answer your question in a future episode or blog post. Remember, for the best of this episode and every episode of Unspoken Words, please follow the podcast on Instagram and YouTube. We are at unspokenwords_podcast on Instagram and Unspoken Words by DRE on YouTube. Or join our newsletter for additional SM content. We release new episodes every other Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you next time.